Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm B, a Winter. I never know how to introduce these anymore since I changed my channel name. I am a writer. I write sort of historical fiction with a fantasy, magical, speculative twist to it. My first short story is coming out in December, and I will soon have a pre-order link for it, which is kind of amazing. But today I'm doing a recommended reading video, which is the sort of new series type. It's not a series. It's a group of videos. It's a type of video I'm going to do whereby I'm recommending books, basically. So I'm not going to be doing book reviews like I have done in the past, but I will recommend books that I've read that I enjoy, especially books that are sort of in my genre, I suppose, that I write. So the first one today is going to be a group of 5 books, and these are all about witches. Since my first short story collection is about witches, but sort of set in the Victorian period, I thought this would be a good little recommended reading video to kick things off with. Some of these are historical fiction that don't necessarily have an obvious supernatural element to them, and some of them are just straight up supernatural witches. And I'm interested in both kinds of witches. I'm interested in all the sorts of ways witches are portrayed in books and film and media, and also the historical reality of witchcraft and where it came from, and persecutions of witches, particularly in England and America in the 17th century. So the first one I'll talk about is kind of appropriate to be the first one, I think, and that is Cersei by Madeline Miller. This is about Cersei. She was the daughter of Zeus, who was obviously a Greek god. She's sort of written in this book as not quite fitting in. She's the black sheep, if you want to call it that, of the family. And anyway, she gets banished to this island, and it's there that she develops witchcraft. She becomes the first witch. And I found this story to be obviously beautifully written. It's written in a way whereby you've got this epic sweeping story about gods and goddesses and Greek legends and myths and heroes. But at the same time, you've got a story about a woman who is isolated on her own and how she copes with that. It made me want to learn more about the myth of Cersei, which I haven't, I will admit. But it is a good starting point, I think, for anyone who is interested in witchcraft, the origins of the idea around witchcraft, or a legend around the origins of the idea of witchcraft, I should say, in the sort of Western world and the Western perception of witchcraft. The next book that I want to recommend is Witchlight by Susan Fletcher. I have recommended this before in my historical fiction recommendations, which I will leave linked whichever side it is. I always get it wrong. And this is historical fiction. The central character is Corag, who is an outcast, right? This is a pretty big theme with witches, which is probably part of the reason why I really love witches and the ideas around witchcraft, because the women who were accused of witchcraft were the outcasts, or very often, not always, but very often they were the ones who lived on the margins of society for reasons of poverty, being widowed, never marrying, perhaps not interested in men and marriage and children. They lived outside of societal norms, and therefore they were deemed witches. And this is kind of this story. So it's set in 1692, and as I said, it follows a woman named Corag, who is living in the Scottish mountains, and she witnesses a real historical event that did happen, which was called the Massacre of Glencoe, which was the sort of culmination of a feud, I think, among Scottish clans. There's a framing narrative of the story whereby Corag is in prison. She has been imprisoned for witchcraft, and she's telling her story to a man named Charles Leslie, who is sort of interested in her story and interested in what she's seen and witnessed, and he's taking her story down from inside this prison, and that's the framing narrative. And as she's telling her story to Charles Leslie, she's also telling the story to us. This is a really quiet book. This is a really slow-paced, introspective, but beautifully written. I read this in a really short amount of time because I just found that I didn't want to put it down. I didn't want to leave this world. It feels so peaceful. So there's no actual magic in this. It's sort of a bit ambiguous, but mostly it is a story about the consequences of being accused of witchcraft. You know, the real life women who lost their lives simply because they didn't fit a societal norm. The next one is kind of along similar lines to that, in the sense that it's a bit ambiguous in whether witchcraft is anything more than just an accusation, just a superstition, and that is The Familiars by Stacey Halls. This is another book that I read really quickly because I really loved it. It follows a noblewoman called Fleetwood Shuttleworth, again in the 17th century. It's sort of set around the Pendle witch trials. So Fleetwood is pregnant, and she's had difficulty in carrying a pregnancy to term in the past, and she's been told that she shouldn't try and get pregnant again because it could end her life, but she does. And then she meets this midwife called Alice Gray, who promises that she will help Fleetwood carry this pregnancy to term and deliver a healthy baby. Fleetwood takes her on, accepts her help, but Alice has been accused of witchcraft. And it's sort of a story about their relationship and about Fleetwood getting more drawn into these accusations and sort of walking this dangerous line of, if she's not careful, she could end up accused. But it's also an interesting juxtaposition, that's the right word, of Alice is poor and her family was poor, so it was much easier to accuse them of witchcraft. It would take a lot more to accuse someone like Fleetwood Shuttleworth of witchcraft because she's noble, because she is married and into the right family, comes from the right family, etc. That isn't a big thing in the book, but I found it an interesting contrast. Again, it's really well written, and I really like books like this and Witchlight that have that ambiguity around magic, because I kind of think, I don't like the idea that the way science and sort of maybe certain historians would look at it and go, well, no, magic didn't exist, it was just whatever it was just superstition. There's a book I read earlier this year that did portray these women as having been actual witches and in league with the devil, and I didn't like that portrayal of witches in that way. So I like books that sort of walk the line of what feels more to me like was probably the reality, that there were women who were practicing what they might have thought of as magic, certainly herbal cures, herbal magics, sort of buying into the superstitions, if you like, of the time, but without that thing of they were actually in league with an actual devil that exists, because I'm not a huge fan of that idea. So I really like books like this and Witchlight that sort of toe that line for historical fiction between those two extremes, that just sort of sit in that middle of, well, these women might have believed in magic at the time and they might have engaged in these practices, but that didn't make them evil, and it didn't make the accusations and the burnings and the consequences of that were inflicted upon them by men mostly at the time, right or okay. And both this one and Witchlight as well really feel well researched and well grounded in history, which I also really like. And along similar lines really is Witch Child by Celia Rees, and this is one I don't have a physical copy of because I read it years ago from the library, and it's one that I actually need to reread. But it's a book that has stuck with me and I remember it even from all those years ago. It's one of those books that kind of informed my reading taste and sort of helped to spark this interest in witchcraft. And this is a YA book. It's presented as like snippets of letters that the narrator has found years after these events in the 17th century, hidden. I think in the intro, they're hidden in bedclothes and things like that. And we're sort of told this story via these letters or these diary entries that this young character was writing when she was experiencing like the witch trials. Central character is called Mary, and her grandmother is accused and tried for witchcraft, leaving Mary on her own. So she travels to the New World, and we sort of follow her as she experiences the fact that this new world isn't necessarily a new start. It's still riddled with all the same superstitions and beliefs and things like that the old world, being England, was. And it focuses more on the historical reality of being tried for witchcraft, being accused of witchcraft, having the accusation follow you, being an outcast, not really fitting in, struggling to belong to a society that has sort of already condemned you for something you didn't even do. And then the last one, this does deal with supernatural witches, with the idea of sort of urban fantasy witchcraft, and that is Bad Witch Burning by Jessica Lewis. This isn't a book that I've heard necessarily anyone else talk about on social media, etc. I found it when I was just doing some random research into YA books that focus on characters living in poverty, and this sort of came up. And me being interested in witches, I was like, oh, I'll read that. So this follows Cottrell, who is a teenager living in the US. She's a black girl and her family's struggling to make ends meet, but she has this power whereby she can summon the dead. So she earns money by summoning people's dead relatives just for them to have a conversation with, just as a comfort thing. But then her powers sort of take a dark turn. She's trying to summon this person's ghost essentially, but she accidentally summons them back from the dead and they come back as a human. And the book sort of follows her. She realises she can charge more money for this, but then there are darker consequences for it. It starts to take a toll on her physically, and she has to sort of make these choices between, well, I can earn a lot of money doing this, and earning this money will give me freedom, but at the same time this is causing negative consequences, and sort of navigating her way between those two things. It's almost like an extended metaphor for getting involved with gangs. The more real world sort of solutions to poverty that young people can often find. I really enjoyed Cottrell's character. I enjoyed the moral dilemma that she has. I enjoyed the friendship between her and her best friend. There's no real love interest in this. It is a book about friendship, which I really do like. And it's also a book about families and navigating that difficult situation of being in the position of you're the adult of the family, really, when your parents have an inability to look after you and look after themselves. There's a lot of contemporary issues in this, but it's also kind of just a take on witchcraft that is interesting. And I wanted to get a non-white take on witchcraft on this list because I think, okay, slight segue. Obviously, the Western view of witchcraft is white, but having read The Witch by Ronald Hutton, which I will leave linked below because it's just a worldwide survey of the history of witchcraft. There is more to witchcraft than our white perception of the witch on the broomstick type of thing. One of my aims for the coming year, I suppose, next year, will be to try and read more non-white, non-Western takes on witchcraft. And it is difficult because then you do get into the question of how do you define witchcraft, because there are books like Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi that is non-white. It is about black characters set in an African-y inspired country, but is it witchcraft? Because then I have to think about what's the difference between something defined as witchcraft and just a fantasy with magic. So that's a question I'm thinking about. It's really easy to have that blinkered view of, oh well, this is what a witch is, but is it? This is my perception of what a witch is because this is the image I've been fed through media, but that's not necessarily the only perception of a witch, the only definition of a witch. Anyway, that's an interesting little segue to end the video on. If you have any witchy book recommendations, historical, contemporary, non-white, diverse reads, let me know down below. Like if you like, subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you next time, hopefully with another video.